Today's guest is Jeff Korhan. I'll bring him on in a minute. I want to share just a couple of things we touch on here. Jeff has a long history in our industry, first running his own landscape company in Chicago called Treemendous, and then going into marketing, consulting, and he even now consults with runners on longevity now that he's really dived into that sport, and he's a little bit older and has learned a few things. So he's got quite a history here. And what we're going to cover is lessons that he learned when he was running his landscape business, like how to brand your processes and make them part of your brand, how to use awards to drive improvement, drive towards getting the award and then living up to the award, how to develop your clients into your sales team by educating them and thereby expanding your sales team, and overall using communication as a strategic advantage. He learned over the years that he should worry less about competition and more about exploiting what made him unique. And he uses all of this understanding of the client experience in his marketing consulting. And now with AI, he's explaining on our podcast here how some of the tools and techniques you use with SEO have reversed. And now there's a whole different approach to building up your website to make it searchable. So you're going to learn about all this and more. We're going to jump right in, and I'll introduce Jeff here with a formal intro that he wrote for me. Welcome to the Ultimate Landscape CEO podcast. Our guest today is Jeff Korhan. I have his bio. It's super short. I'm going to read it to you right now before I introduce him on the show. Jeff Korhan was a marketing executive for the first decade of his career. So he worked in corporate America. Then he founded a residential design build landscape company in suburban Chicago. And that company earned dozens of industry and community awards for his 20 years of ownership. Nowadays, he's a professional speaker, an author, and industry consultant, I believe, in the field of marketing, which he's very good at. And then on a personal level, Jeff's life experiences includes marathons. He's a big runner, a triathlon, cliff diving, meditating in the deserts of India. Jeff Korhan, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jeffrey. Thank you.
Man, you have quite a series of careers, and we won't get into the corporate America part, but tell us how you decided to get into landscaping and then share with us, looking backwards, what were the things that made you most successful?
Well, getting into landscaping was actually kind of interesting. I was going to study horticulture at Ohio State University, and for some reason, I had reasons why I wasn't going to go to school there. But long story short is I kind of got talked out of that by my mom, but that became kind of irrelevant because I was on a ROTC scholarship at the time. I went to school at Miami of Ohio, and the Navy basically said you can major in anything you want to as long as it's chemistry, math, or physics. So that's how I ended up in chemistry. And, I had a nice run with that, did the corporate thing for 10 years in the chemical business, the oil business. But when I decided it was time for me to start a business, which is just something I never thought I would do at the time when I got out of college, but I realized that I'm not exactly the best corporate animal. My thoughts came back to landscaping. I've always loved it. I still do, even though I'm not running a construction business anymore. But it was a natural for me. I mean, I really felt comfortable with it. As you know, there's a lot of hard work in building one of these businesses. But when you're enjoying what you're doing, everything seems to fit.
And your company name was Treemendous, is that right?
Kind of a dumb name. I still think about that. But yeah, Treemendous, which I've come to find out later was a name that a lot of companies thought about and many still have. So it was a play on words, of course.
You made a big mark in the landscape industry. And now you're a consultant. So it must be easy enough for you to look back and analyze what you did well. So take us through a few of those learning points.
Boy, where do we start? Like most other entrepreneurs, I made all the early mistakes of trying to do everything myself, not having systems and on and on. So we don't need to go through all that. But yeah, those were some of the breakthroughs is when I, excuse me, I got in a coaching program called the Strategic Coach and started learning a different perspective on systems, from the business point of view. And that's when I really made the effort to kind of refine our processes, but also to brand our design build process, which made a lot of sense because our biggest challenge was design fees. And why should I pay you for design, Jeff, when I've got all these other people giving it away? Which is a pretty good question. And so we figured out ways around that and eventually did get our fees and did build the business. And, everything was great, but it took a lot of years to really work through that. And so I suppose that's something that all entrepreneurs, all landscape company owners share is, there's more than one way to do it. You got to find out a way that works for you, that works for your market. And of course, most importantly, works for the clients, the people you serve.
So tell us more about branding your processes. What does that mean? What does that even mean, really?
That's something they taught us in that coaching program. And the idea is basically this, that it gives you something tangible, how you do things that can become either your primary or your secondary brand. So we called it, we thought of it as a secondary brand. And we had the Treemendous name, but the process, we called it the Intelligent Landscape System. And the best part of branding that was people would say, what the heck is that? Or ask them about, or those that understood it after having it explained to them would say, when you talk to Jeff, ask them about their process. So that was really a key breakthrough because it differentiated us and it gave us that sort of extra, at least it opened a door. That was enough. If it didn't do anything more than that, great, but it gave us an opportunity to explain what I just said. Why are we charging for designs and nobody else is? Well, we all know the reason for that.
And you didn't say this, but it would certainly help you scale your sales team if if you had not only a process, but it's branded so you have to follow it.
It did. It did a lot. In fact, I was kind of surprised at this, but we attracted people, some really quality people who had interviewed with much, much larger companies or maybe worked for them for a period of time and just felt like they were, not really using their talents. And that's where we were able to say, look, we have a system that ensures you succeed. All you got to do is run the system. You don't have to figure this stuff out on your own. And so that definitely became a differentiating factor.
I know you won a lot of awards. It was in your intro. The question always is it for ego play or did it really help build your team and your business?
I think I wouldn't say a lot of ego play, but that's part of it. Sure. The big aha for us was the fact that after winning that award, it brought the attention where people expected us to be really good. And so now we had to prove that. And so this is where things like branding your process and being able to demonstrate what makes you good, come into play. So as a result of this, we sort of became intentional about breaking down everything we did so that we could, how do I say this, defend our way of doing things and explain to people why, let's say, putting a concrete base or stoop in that leads out to a patio, a brick paver patio, and why all this engineering, Jeff, with the rebar and whatnot. Other guys are just going to put the bricks in. Well, that's what I started saying was they're just going to put the bricks in and it's all going to settle because things typically settle against the foundation. And isn't it worth it $1,500, a couple $1,000 to do this thing right and have it live, last for 30, 40, 50 years? And, people would start to say, yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it.
Are you saying that this is what I heard you say, that you learned how to win awards and then you had to learn how to back it up?
Right, exactly.
And so I guess what I'm hearing is you use that award winning as leverage to encourage your team to step up and go with you on this journey and to step up and do better work.
Exactly. I mean, you got to keep in mind that I was new to this. I had no formal training in this. That first award-winning project, I can't tell you how many experts in the industry I consulted with to do the lighting, to do the foundation for the wall and to build the wall and to do the brick, the masonry work, the water feature, on and on. It was, I probably broke even on the project, but obviously it was worth all that effort because it was educational for us as well as anyone else.
So how many awards in the lands? How many years of awards did you win? Like every year you won another award?
We tried to do that. Yeah, some years, couple, maybe three, and other years none. Because there's state awards, there's national awards. The pinnacle for me was winning I think it's called the Grand Award, or was at the time in Planet at the time, and now NALP. But that was kind of a cool project that had the makings of being something that really stands out because it was a September 11th memorial. And, it wasn't a residential project. It was working in our community. And it did win that big award. And we thought it would. But, we were more advanced at that point in time. That was many years later. Had some great landscape architects that knew way more than I knew. And, they really carried the day and made that thing happen.
I think that's got to be the best answer I've ever heard to why should we do awards? You really gave it someone who's engineering a business, you gave it a good structural answer to how it helped you build the business.
Yeah, I don't know if it's a self-doubt thing, but I feel like if you're going to walk the walk, you better be able to back it up. And, as we're in kind of a visual business, these landscapes, but, somebody that truly knows what they're doing can look at it at a glance and say, this isn't right and that's not quite right. So those are the things I try to always sweat those details.
I've also heard you say that educating your clients makes them part of your extended sales force. Do you want to say more about that?
Sure. Well, because I don't know, I discovered this by accident when I first got into the business. There were no credentials that I could find other than being a certified arborist. So I went after that and I started learning about pruning and things like that. And then I started noticing, I'm like, why is everybody doing it, not the right way based upon what I was just taught? And so I started, today we call this content marketing. Back then I did this with like little ads in these neighborhood bulletins where I would educate people on pruning. And, that would generate a meeting and they'd ask me, well, then why is everybody doing it this way? I said, I have no idea. I said, all I can reason is that, a few people do it. Everybody else follows. We all think that's the way it should be done. But it isn't. And they understood the education behind it, how they could get much more longevity out of these plants if they were properly pruned, not to mention make everything look better instead of shearing things into, circles and squares and that kind of thing.
So what else? I get that example and it's a great example. And by the way, the reason the competitors don't do it is because it's hard. It's more expensive.
Yeah. It takes time. Yeah. It is expensive. Yeah.
So where else did you educate your clients that helped you turn them into an extended sales force?
I don't think I ever really nailed this one, but I would try to quiz them about how they're referring me. What are you saying? And so we would sort of survey them and they'd say a lot of different things like, they cost a little bit more, but it's worth it. I'm like, okay, that's good. I'm okay with that. What do you mean? How are we worth it? And over time, we would get to those points that made a difference to them. I think for the most part, they felt like, look, they're not taking a cookie cutter approach. They're not giving me these plants because that's what they had in the yard that day. They're literally starting and trying to give me something unique, which we did. You work in these neighborhoods where, you might be doing several houses on the same street. You don't want them all to look the same. You want to basically, honor the architecture of the home, the client's needs and tastes and things like that. So, that's where kind of it was a two-way street. We're educating them and they're educating us and helping us then educate the next client who hopefully will have maybe a mindset like they have.
Okay. I know you were always a fanatic for communication. Tell me why, and how did you use that to build your business?
That one was easy. I've always been interested in communication. I wouldn't say I'm the best, but I think I do a pretty good job. But it was sort of the old story. We've all heard this. I called up 5 landscapers. You're the only one that showed up. Or, nobody took the time. This was actually before, I'm dating myself, before cell phones. I mean, I had them in the beginning, but they certainly were only turned on when it was an important call. But, a lot of people didn't follow up. And we kind of learned through, the early days of CRMs that if you start tracking these calls and somebody calling them back, even to call them back to say, hey, I have no answers. Everybody's in the field, but we'll get back to you. That was enough. And that made a big difference. And, just working with a client, I forget which one this week or the past week, we were just talking about this, that, we would send out an annual or maybe twice a year mailing. This was before digital. Nowadays we've got email, and so we can do a mailing as often as we want, which creates another problem. So you got to figure that out. But obviously, the more you're in touch with those clients in the right way, that's building relationships. And this is something that I'm really acutely aware of nowadays as search gets tougher, and search is now predominantly AI answers to questions. It's not really keyword search as we have known it all these years. So it's really, we're getting into a world where if you're not really thinking about this and understanding what's on the minds of the people you're trying to serve, it's going to get tougher and tougher to be found.
Okay. Do you teach your clients to be fanatical communicators?
I do, and not everybody embraces it. Well, let's say that maybe they embrace it in the way that they're most accustomed to, and I get that. Some people have to do it face to face. Some people like to be on the phone. There's a lot of texting that going on. I'm not a big fan of texting because I think things get lost very easily, misinterpreted because they're short. But I believe you got to make your best effort and try to create multimedia. Try to do some videos every now and then. Try to meet face to face. Pick up the phone. Have a newsletter. I'm really, honestly, I've been surprised all these years why more companies don't do a regular newsletter, because these are your clients on the other end of that. And if you've made a sale once, obviously the easiest sale is a follow-up versus a new lead, selling to a new lead.
Yeah. And so why don't we segue? I have a few more questions about your landscape business, but let's segue a little bit and tell us about your consulting business.
Well, I think you just kind of covered it. I mean, it's evolving like anything else. It kind of started out as consulting, then during COVID became more of a marketing agency. Now it's kind of a blend of everything, and it's less about the stuff probably that we're in a very short period of time we're going to be able to automate through AI agents. All that manipulation of the data and whatnot. It's really more about helping people with the brand and helping their clients, building that brand and finding that unique thing about them that stands out. How do we make you, a category of one so that you stand out in your market? And I would say, if anything, that's my focus.
Say more. I like that.
Say more. Without giving any specific examples, there are people in this industry that, when you hear about the company, you immediately think of so-and-so, who's the leader of the company, or a couple of leaders, or you think about their market or how long they've been in the industry or something about that. Maybe there's a certain type of personality. Maybe it's a woman-owned business, something like that. There's always something that can be leveraged to stand out in a market. I mean, even with the most mundane clients, like he retired, but I had a client for quite a few years who all they did was mow lawns, but they had sort of this little niche that, people, and I talk to a lot of their clients. One of the things I do is I independently call their clients to see what I hear. And most often I hear things that they never hear or would have heard. And it's not always positive, but it's always helpful. And, there's always kind of some nuggets in there about why do you stick around with this company? And man, that's the goal that you can really leverage out there to become, found in that marketplace.
It's sort of counterintuitive. I mean, I agree with your concept 100%. However, it's counterintuitive in the green industry where many people think, hey, we all do the same thing. We make tall grass short and we move piles of snow from one side of the parking lot to the other. I mean, I'm sort of generalizing here or exaggerating, but so can you do this with any company in the green industry? Can we find a way
I,
to make
I,
them unique?
I really believe I can. If they're willing to do the work. See, that's the tough thing you know, it's not that they're not willing to do the work. It's that they do already have a lot of work to do now. So we got to figure out how to, find somebody to support them so that they've got that extra time. Because obviously, if you're maxed out, you need time to do new things. And so you've got to take some things off your plate. So that becomes the first challenge. But, you mentioned snow. We also did snow plowing, and I'm a founding member of the Snow and Ice Management Association. So I go way back in that industry. And one of the things I learned early on was something called a snow response plan, which was a new thing to me. And that became part of our proposal process. And so being a company with maybe a dozen trucks versus competitors with, I don't know, probably hundreds of pieces of equipment back then. And I'm sure there's much larger companies nowadays. But we were able to hold our own and win some of those jobs. And it was because of what went into the planning stages and what went into that presentation. And that was my thought process was, look, if we can be hyper thorough about analyzing the site and addressing everything, every concern that's on that property manager's mind, we stand a good chance of getting the business. And we did. So we did all right with that.
And so you were a marketing agency, you said, and now you're a blend of marketing, consulting, and a marketing agency. What does that mean exactly? Like, if I was going to recommend someone to your firm today, and they said, "Oh, what does Jeff Korhan do? What does his company do?" Lay it out for us.
Well, let's just say that I still do some of the agency work, but I'm trying not to take on any more of that work. The strategy work is where I excel. And so my ideal client, I guess, if you will, would be somebody who is, I don't know, doing well or could do better, or maybe having some challenges. It's real, there's a lot of companies that don't really have a strategy. And that really is going to sound stupid to a lot of people until you start thinking about what really is strategy, which is really going out to the future and saying, okay, what conditions have to exist for me to achieve these goals I'm trying to achieve? There's a lot of things that have to happen. And how do you get there means then you got to dial it all the way back to the resources you have. What can you commit? What can you control? What can't you control? And you have to, weigh the odds of everything and the risks and the resources and figure out how to get there. But if you're willing to go to that next level, then that is possible. And so, that's really how companies can grow. I mean, I think companies, there's so many different ways to grow through acquisition, through new markets, through different offerings, commercial versus residential. We tried that. It was I wouldn't say an absolute failure, but the shift from residential to commercial didn't treat us well. And we luckily were able to backtrack and realign with our original vision, and it worked. But yeah, there's just so many ways to do it. But I mean, having a strategy, to me, you have that, it puts everybody at ease. It unifies the team. It takes the finger pointing out of the whole, okay, now what do we do? You go back to the strategy, and then of course the plan that implements that. That's another confusion factor where people, they think they have a strategy and they really just have a plan that they're working off of. Well, those market elements and conditions and economy and whatever change, that means your strategy has to change with them. So there's a lot of things going on there.
What's your view on competition when you were in your business and when you're consulting? Do you tell people to analyze and understand where you fit? Or do you tell people to, hey, just focus on getting better and more valuable and what makes you unique? Or what's your approach?
That's an interesting question, because when I was working on my MBA, and I don't know about you when you worked on yours, but we spent an inordinate amount of time on the competition, these matrices and how we divide it. But then it's all geared towards like the examples out of the textbook, which were probably retail and things like that. Now, fast forward to the business I was in, the oil business, we worked on our pricing, a penny a gallon was a massive difference. And a lot of that was driven by the oil supply and then the downstream, efficiencies and so forth. But, long story short, things kind of happen. Competition was who was cutting the price and there was there was a trust factor in price. Did you trust the company that's giving you that low price or not? And maybe that does apply to this industry. But my perception about the landscaping industry was, I had all kinds of competitors, especially another one that worked in mostly the same areas I did. I came to the conclusion that we really weren't competing. So I said, Jeff, quit worrying about the competition. Learn what you can from them. That's where you should honor the competition and what they do, because you'll learn some things. You'll learn some things not to do. But I felt like, George was my competitor. I felt like, people that gravitate towards his way of doing things are always going to go his way. People that gravitate towards our process are going to like us more. And so I felt like just forget the competition, focus on what you're doing and just do that well.
Okay. And is that how you help your current clients?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, every business is different, but many of them, let's just say, are residential type companies. And so, yeah, like commercial, we all know is very competitive. They're dealing mostly with personalities and things of that nature in the residential world. And that's where, who they are as a company, as people that run that company, and amplifying those personal brands behind the brand, that to me, that's much easier than how things work in the commercial world. There's more wheels in my mind turning in the commercial world, because you got to be number competitive. You've got all kinds of competitors and you've got to keep your eye out for them. But in residential, I really don't think that's, just keep doing what you're doing well and you should stay ahead of the game.
What do you say to companies, salespeople, owners who will claim that, it's really competitive out there. I don't know that I could, raise my price by $5 an hour, pick a number. What's your response?
Well, it's price is an interesting thing. I guess I got to think, quit thinking about when I was in the field. And nowadays, labor has never been easy, but labor is extremely difficult these days. And I think if you're doing residential, you're dealing with discretionary income, that you should be able to get a reasonable price, and maybe even a better than reasonable price, because if you've earned the trust and are really following up and communicating and just giving, just taking all the worry out of them. I think that's what most buyers in any industry want these days is look at the world we live in. You can return anything to Amazon. You can return a car probably if you're not happy with it. That's, and if you're not honoring, if your business doesn't accept returns in that way, or at least set yourself up to defend, what you've built or delivered or served, then you're probably going to have some problems. Almost everything, we kind of live in a guaranteed kind of a world, and you got to find a way to live with that and make that work for you.
Me about this statement here: seeking out meaningful work. When the work matters to you and your teams, success and career longevity tend to follow.
Mm-hmm. Well, we in the early days of, I guess this would be Alka, there were a bunch of roll-ups, and it seemed like when I would go to some of these conferences, like the Executive Forum, we called it back then, they were having a lot of fun and making a lot of money in the commercial landscaping segment, and I wasn't. So we found our way into that. We had residential clients who happened to manage commercial properties. That was part of their business. And so we did get into that to some extent, but it became a distraction to our people who joined us because of who we were, that residential company. We started to lose people. People started to get unhappy at work. And when we went back to our knitting, I suppose is how you could put it, and backed out of all the commercial work, almost all of it, maybe one or two clients we kept because we talked it through and they said, no, we still want to stick with you guys. So we did. But we, then things changed for the better. We were sort of chasing dollars to some extent. And as it turns out, the dollars were there. We were just too busy moving back and forth between two kind of diverse segments that we lost our focus. And once we regained that focus, everything started working out great.
It's like that book, Acres of Diamonds, where all the
I
diamonds
didn't know that one.
It's a story about you searched the world for diamonds, but they were in your backyard all along.
Yeah, totally.
So tell us about the future, AI, marketing. How are things going to change? How are you helping your clients adjust or make those changes?
We're doing some simple things right now. I think I wrote an article for Landscape Management about this, that they should have on their websites kind of an AI summary. I think we call it. You can call it whatever you want. It's just basically a page that lists all the information that would be useful if ChatGPT or Gemini or whomever wanted to refer your business. So what are your strengths? What are your weaknesses? What markets do you serve? Your pricing, all the things that would be interesting for somebody who, you might get one shot at a lead where somebody's looking for a company like yours. And if the information is incomplete, that's a lost lead. But if you have all that information out there, the origins of the company backstory. This is one of my greatest frustrations is so many of these companies that have been around for decades, they miss the opportunity to tell that backstory. And even if you're a 10-year company, you still have a backstory. I think that, you look at IPOs these days and how do we value this thing? And there's all kinds of ways to do that. But the one thing, look at Elon Musk and the SpaceX IPO. It's the narrative that they're putting behind it. Now, most people are not buying the narrative because they say the numbers don't come close to matching up with that. We'll see. It's going to go public here in a few weeks. But that narrative is vitally important for living successfully in the AI search world. This is giving them the information in human language, in a conversational style language. Forget the keywords. Just tell it like you were telling your mother. This is what we do. This is how we make our money. This is what we like to do. This is what we don't like to do. Exclude things. We don't want this kind of work. Tell all of that to AI. Put this on a single page. We typically hide it, so to speak. We put it in the footer instead of, you don't need to put it up in the prominent nav. But, as long as it's on your website, AI is going to find it because they find everything. And and then test it. Then get on all these AI LLMs and ask them, if you were to recommend our company, or if I were to ask you to tell me everything you know about my company, what would that be? And see how much they can tell you back. And we've, it's really been working well for my clients.
Wow, that's great. Great
Yeah,
advice.
that's an easy one.
It's kind of like with SEO and Google, there's all these rules and you got to follow these rules. Otherwise, the Google will discount what you're doing or saying. And what I'm hearing now is it's the opposite. No rules and just put it out there and AI will pick it up.
Almost true. Yeah, pretty much true. I mean, the best way to approach it, if you don't know anything about this, is just to think of AI as a human being, which of course it isn't. But talk to it just like you would talk to a friend. Forget all the AI, what you've learned about AI, because I'm not saying it's all irrelevant now. It isn't. But if you think about conversational language, and I suppose the biggest thing is to remember that, AI learns by patterning and things like that. So if you ask them about this, they'll find things like it and sort of connect the dots. So the nuances often get lost. And if you can be giving that information to AI, and this gets back to that branding and maybe the personal brand behind the brand, this is where you start to shine and really kind of stand out because, I'll just give you from a recent experience. I like to read memoirs and I'm running out of some to read. And I asked Gemini to give me a list and they gave me a list and I gave them some feedback, or him or her, whatever it is. And, it sent me another list. I said, no, I've read all those. And so we went back and forth and it's trying to understand what I am really interested in. And I kind of enjoy that interplay because it helps me understand how are they figuring out how to respond to me, and going through a lot of that and forgetting about this whole business about, the magical prompt that's going to give you just the perfect answer. Just have conversations with them so you understand how they gather information. Because, for example, we had a key link to one of our clients' websites. We asked the AI about that company. It gave us a lot of great information, much of which came back from that AI page we've been talking about. I said, well, what about the link to this source? It said, we didn't find that. I says, oh, well, it's here. I gave the name of the source. Still didn't find it. I says, well, here's the link. So now I gave it the actual link and I said, got it. And so in my mind, hopefully it's registered with that. I don't remember if it was ChatGPT or Gemini, but now it's hopefully in that AI training of it, that maybe when a client asks, they'll say, oh yeah, they've done some good work. They got some good referrals, meaning powerful links, social proof links. We might want to consider them. So, it's kind of trying to understand the game, how it's being played, and do the best you can with it. And because it's just going to keep changing. It's changing so fast. I mean, you just want to not ignore it.
Yeah. Hey, to wrap up here, I want to talk about your personal life a little bit, or your other business.
How personal?
Well, we'll talk about your running career. And you love running marathons, and you've competed around the world. And I think you're also advising other people of age on how to maintain their longevity in running.
Right.
Is that right?
It is. It is. I've been running my whole life. And, I did, back when I had my landscaping company, I did triathlons with a couple of guys. And, that was, it kind of kept me anchored. It kept me healthy, gave me kind of a routine to my life, because to squeeze all that in, you definitely, well, for one thing, I had to get up at 4:30 instead of the usual time, a lot earlier, and maybe work a little bit later. But it was such a good thing. And it definitely kept me healthier than I was, burning myself out when I was running that business prior to that. But somehow I got back into this about 10 years ago. And that's when I really started getting interested in the marathons. And concurrently, I started reading about just everything, nutrition, sleep, prioritizing all these things. And it's made me a happier person, to say the least, but also a healthier person. Because the nice thing about a hobby like running is, it's keeping you healthy, but at the same time, it's also keeping you don't have all those distractions, whether it's eating too much, drinking too much, partying too much, whatever. Those seem to go by the wayside. And so for me, that's kind of been a big growth area. And it's one reason why I'm planning, while I'm at retirement age, I have no plans to be, I give myself at least another 10 years, maybe more. But yeah, I've just because of who I am, I always like to learn about what I'm doing. So I become certified as a strength coach. Now I'm working on my certification for a running coach, and they drop me in on their website. So that's it. I'm not doing any marketing, but they send some people to me, and I'm doing my best to help them out. And it's kind of a new thing, but we'll see where it goes, because it's fun for me. And I like to share good information. And I would say to call me a running geek. I mean, for as long as I can remember, when I was an early teenager, I've been obsessed with running. So for me, it's just something I love doing.
Okay. Do you want to share with the audience how they can find out basically your URLs and where they can find out more about your professional services and your running services?
Sure. To find me for a landscape company, I would be at True Nature, just the way you would spell it, truenature.com. For running, right now it's runninglongevitylab.com. And if you just Googled my name, Jeff Korhan, Korhan, it's a fairly unique name, so you would find me pretty easily. I know all the spammers find me, so it should be easy to find me.
Give us advice, just to wrap up here. One or two pieces of advice for the landscape entrepreneur listening to this podcast. Given things are changing fast, but for where they are today, one or two pieces of advice.
I think probably the best advice I could give anybody is to believe in what you're doing. We touched on this, don't worry about the competition. Don't worry about the economy. I mean, there's all kinds of jokes about this, that the economy's, and because that was me. I sweated everything, and there was no need for that. Just believing in what you're doing. And my gosh, because as somebody who's now on the other side of this, buying landscaping services, I'm looking for a good company. I'm willing to pay more. The guy that I work with, I'd say 90% of the time, everything works out great. And the few times that it hasn't, he's taken care of things. And that's the world we're living in these days, where people have discretionary income, most of them. I would say anybody buying landscaping services, rather than doing them themselves, is going to have that discretionary income. And if you're a business, obviously you want your facilities to look great. That I can't imagine I just think this industry is going to get stronger and stronger. I look back to what it was like 30 years ago, and it's stunning to me. It really is. What are your thoughts? You look back on what was a big company back then, and there's just no limit to where we're going. And so that's kind of my message is,
Totally agree. I think
yeah.
every 10 years, we make another big jump forward.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's like, oh, how couldn't get any better or bigger than this? And every 10 years, I was just mentioning this on another podcast, that the concept of cocooning came out decades ago. And
yeah,
and it's still accelerating and increasing. So I 100% agree. Great industry. And we're not finished yet, are we?
No. And maybe what people need is an experience like I had. Maybe you did too, but working in an office, flying all around the country, there's some fun to that when you're young. I was in my 20s, but I would much rather be outside, visiting clients, walking their properties, things like that. There's a lot to love about this industry.
Jeff, really appreciate your time here.
Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Okay, take care.